Hello, I'm Zelenskyy. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. In this episode, we're diving into the topic of Ukraine's upcoming peace summit in Switzerland. Now, if you think peace summits are as serene and uneventful as a yoga retreat, think again. With several dozen delegations agreed to be there, including some newcomers to the issue, like India, for example, the upcoming summit is one to look out for. And that is why we will cover all of what we know about the event at this point. The peace proposal pushed by Volodymyr Zelenskyy will be in the limelight. But what does it entail? That and all the other questions we'll try to answer later. But first, let's take a look at this next report to find out more.
The summit is being organized by the Swiss government and is set for mid-June. It aims to establish a framework for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. This will, however, not be accomplished through negotiations between the warring sides, as Russia has not been invited. Switzerland has invited 160 countries to attend. While most of the confirmed attendees are Western nations, Switzerland hopes to include countries from the Global South, which so far has not taken an involved stance on the conflict. This arrangement, in which Ukraine-friendly states are included while Russia is explicitly excluded, puts Switzerland in an apparently pro-Western position. The Kremlin has previously described Switzerland as openly hostile and unfit to mediate peace efforts. This is mainly due to the Swiss government joining in on the European Union's sanctions against Russia. The decision made in 2022 was a major break from the Swiss policy of neutrality. Another came earlier this year, when Switzerland allowed for the exports of tanks bought from its stock to Ukraine. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, two other long-time neutral states, Finland and Sweden, decided to join NATO. According to a recent poll, 91% of Swiss people are in favor of maintaining neutrality, and as such, Switzerland is unlikely to go this far. Nevertheless, Switzerland's neutral mindset and neutral image have been changed by the war in Ukraine.
And now we're zooming in on Switzerland to see what this peace summit can really achieve. Let's set the stage. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has announced that Russia will not be invited to the peace summit. Why is that so? Well, because according to Zelenskyy, inviting Russia would be like asking a fox to guard a henhouse. He said, and I quote, "They are always blocking everything. They will undermine the process, and they won't rest until they present us with their own plan for ending the war, which will inevitably be an ultimatum. Much like inviting your ex to be your wedding planner, it's bound to end in disaster." Zelenskyy is adamant that Ukraine's agenda can't be dictated by Russia, and it's a valid point. After all, this is a war against Ukraine, and expecting the aggressor to lead peace talks is like letting the wolf write the rules for the sheep. Now, the fact that so many countries are rallying behind Ukraine for this summit shows a broad recognition of the peace framework Ukraine has proposed. Much like getting thumbs up from your group chat after suggesting a wild Friday night plan. If everyone's on board, you know you're onto something, right? Zelenskyy's goal is to come up with a unified stance on three key questions alongside Ukraine's allies, and then present a united front to Russia. It's a strategic move, aiming to develop a detailed plan that Russia can't easily dismiss. But wait, Zelenskyy has also been cozying up to China. Yes, China, the nation that has been playing the world's longest game of seemingly neutral diplomacy. Zelenskyy recently had a phone call with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who assured him that Beijing supports Ukraine's territorial integrity. So that has to be a good thing, right? And if you're wondering, no, this wasn't a call made on a whim after a couple of late-night drinks. It actually came shortly after Russian President Vladimir Putin's two-day bromance visit to China, during which Russia and China pledged deeper strategic cooperation with one another. Now, China, ever the enigmatic player, has never actually condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Instead, they have released a vaguely worded 12-point position on resolving the conflict. Ahead of the summit, Xi Jinping has called for negotiations that consider both sides' positions. It is a move that sounds neutral at face value, but is as clear as mud when you're in the middle of a war. Meanwhile, Switzerland is stepping up to host the summit, highlighting its alignment with Western Europe over Russia. Swiss neutrality has taken on a new flavor. As their foreign ministry pointed out, being neutral does not mean being indifferent. Switzerland has condemned Russia's aggression against Ukraine, proving that even neutrals have a breaking point. The summit will focus on global concerns such as nuclear safety, freedom of navigation, food security and humanitarian issues. The Swiss have justified not inviting Russia on the grounds that Moscow has shown no interest in participating. The Kremlin predictably has labeled Switzerland as openly hostile and unfit to mediate peace efforts, mainly because of its support for EU sanctions against the Kremlin. So, what's the takeaway here? The peace summit in Switzerland is shaping up to be less about immediate peace and more about rallying support for the invaded Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is playing his cards close to his chest, working with allies to forge a path forward that doesn't let Russia call the shots. And now, here to shed more light on the issue at hand is our guest, Andreas Umland, a political scientist from the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
So, what are your expectations when it comes to the peace summit in Switzerland? What is it likely to achieve with what we know already when it comes to the countries willing to participate and those which will probably not make an appearance?
In fact, you mentioned already what I'm most curious about. This is the question of who will actually attend, how many delegations there will be, and how highly these various countries will be represented. So this is going to be a summit, and those distinct from the previous meetings in this sort of format with the Ukrainian peace formula. So the question will be who will come and how well represented the countries will be. And the other part that is interesting here are the working groups, the 10 working groups of this Ukrainian peace formula, the 10 points of this peace proposal, and whether there will be any advantage with this. I don't think there will be any breakthrough, but the representativeness of this meeting is going to be the crucial question.
So do you think that the host, Switzerland, will be striving for at least some sort of parity, i.e. so that you wouldn't have some of the countries represented by members of government, by foreign ministers, or even higher than that, while the others will just be sending under-secretaries of state, or even lower, some sort of just, members of the administration which don't really have the power to actually make any crucial decisions? Does it even happen that you have this sort of lack of parity during such summits, or is it basically included in the formula that you're either you take it or leave it? You're either sending someone that can make these decisions, they do represent the state to the full extent, or you simply skip the summit altogether.
I don't know what the policy here of Switzerland is. I only know that 160 countries were invited, and the last number I heard that 50 countries have so far confirmed their participation. Yes, I think the Ukrainian side will certainly like to see as highly represented delegations with perhaps not just ministers, but perhaps even prime minister or president represented. But I don't think that is actually the main question. The main question is rather the number of countries that will be represented, and also how many there will be from the so-called global south, from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia.
That's exactly the point, isn't it?
Yes. So this is the main issue here. And one hopes that, as it was with some of the UN General Assembly votings, that there will be a high affirmation of this Ukrainian peace formula by as many as possible countries.
So it has to be assumed that most countries represented in the UN were invited, generally, out of courtesy. I mean, you're probably not going to invite countries like North Korea or Iran. There might be difficulties also with countries like Afghanistan, whose government is basically not recognized by pretty much anyone. But apart from that, most of them will be invited. Some of them will simply not be stakeholders. So they might say, oh, we're skipping that because we don't really have a say. We don't have a stake in what's being decided either. But there are countries which do have a stake and which could be very important there when it comes to forging some sort of agreement. And now out of these, we know that India most likely will be there. We don't really know about China yet. Russia, very unlikely. Brazil, probably not attending. What is your take on that when it comes to the BRICS countries in particular?
Yes, this is a sad development. I also suspect that China will not be attending. The ties between Beijing and Moscow are now simply too close. And since Russia is not attending, China will probably also not be represented. I hope I'm wrong, and maybe a lower ranking delegation will be sent. I do not exclude this. But the signal that I've heard from Brazil, that Brazil will not be attending, I'm surprised, unpleasantly surprised, because Brazil is also, or the territory of Brazil is a former colony, and one would have thought that from former colonies there should be more support for this anti-colonial war. And also, I think that in a way you could argue that for countries in the global south, the general outcome of this summit would be more interesting than, let's say, because the Ukrainian example is, of course, something that is not just important for Europe, but it's important worldwide. Ukraine is an ordinary UN member country, and Russia wants to take away its territory and its sovereignty, and has already destroyed much of Ukraine. And if Russia gets away with this, then other countries around the world that do not have weapons of mass destruction of powerful alliances may be also under threat, because then stronger countries may take Russia's behavior and Russia's citizens as an example.
So let me reiterate, because we did have some connection problems. Basically, countries of the global south might not actually be willing to accept the sort of thinking that we are suggesting, i.e., look, Russia is behaving like a colonial power. We know that countries of the West did behave like that. We have changed our ways. We are recognizing that the question of sovereignty, of the right of self-determination among nations of the world is a thing. Russia doesn't seem to do that, right? So Russia seems to be behaving like we did back in the 19th century or even earlier than that. But is the global south really receptive towards these arguments? It does unfortunately seem like when it comes to this sort of struggle for the hearts and minds of leaders and ordinary people in Africa, South America, we're actually not doing very well at all. I mean, recent developments, for example, Russia making huge advances in Africa, say in Niger. I mean, an American base is to be vacated. There has been a plan for abandoning the base put forward because Russians have installed themselves right next door. This doesn't really inspire confidence, right? In this sort of narrative that, look, we're going to go out there, we're going to talk to the global south, and we're going to present our arguments, and these arguments will make it possible to produce some sort of new equilibrium, right? Doesn't seem to be working so far, at least not in all cases.
Is that the behavior of at least some countries of the global south is simply a reaction to the Western support for Ukraine, and they see here an opportunity by not supporting Ukraine or even by supporting Russia to sort of pay back former colonial empires, Western colonial empires, for what they did in earlier times to them. And they don't see the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as it is. They just see it from this sort of contextual perspective, and they don't understand that this is an anti-colonial war by Russia, and they also don't understand that this is a war, the results of which will touch upon the security of some of these countries, because, as I said, if Russia gets away with its behavior, then this could become an example, and then other countries that want to revise borders, that want to infringe upon the territorial integrity, political sovereignty of their neighbors, they may take Russia's behavior as an example, and this then can be very dangerous for...
So it emboldens autocrats, right? One final question, because unfortunately we are approaching the conclusion of our conversation. Recently, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Mr. Alexander Litvinenko, has suggested that the war will end at a negotiating table. And he also said that, look, we have the Zelenskyy peace plan. This is something that we want to present to you during the peace summit in Switzerland. But should we read more into this, i.e. that Ukraine recognizes it might not be able to regain all of its territories? Would that be a good thing? Ukraine, of course, and also Mr. Litvinenko said that we want a lasting peace. We don't want like a temporary truce that Russia is going to break sooner or later. Is it possible to actually sit down with Russia, make a deal, and have this deal survive for more than a couple of years, after which we have a deja vu with Russian tanks rolling across the border once again?
Yes, at the end of this war, there will have to be some sort of deal. And how exactly this will happen is, of course, very difficult to foresee right now. And that's why these meetings like that, which is forthcoming in Switzerland, are important, because these meetings will sort of preview the results of such negotiations. But Ukraine is, I think, aware that, or maybe even Ukraine will prefer actually to end this with negotiations, if, of course, the result of these negotiations will be the restoration of territorial integrity of Ukraine, the preservation of political sovereignty, and also the implementation of justice. All of this would then be topics of such negotiations. Currently, this is difficult to imagine, but perhaps in a different situation, both on the ground in Ukraine and perhaps also a different political situation in Moscow, such negotiations would then be possible and make sense.
So, I mean, most wars end like that, with the exception of the likes of, for example, the Korean War. There wasn't really any sort of peace treaty signed properly. So there is this state of hostility that has been frozen there. Nevertheless, given that Russia's demands for the time being are fairly abstract, demilitarization, mentioning Nazis in Kiev, I mean, this is not something that you can negotiate, really. So for the time being, at least, it seems that the country to blame for the lack of progress on the diplomatic front clearly is Russia. Andreas Umland was our guest today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us here and for sharing your expertise.
Thanks for having me.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. The European Union has approved the use of proceeds from some of the frozen Russian assets as aid to Ukraine. The move could see Kiev gain an additional €3 billion this year.
The decision was announced on Tuesday following the meeting of the European Council. The policy applies to the assets of the Russian Central Bank specifically, not all frozen assets belonging to Russians. The bank's frozen assets amount to some €210 billion and are expected to generate about €3 billion a year in interests. 90% of these funds will be transferred to European Peace Facility funds, which is used to reimburse EU member states for the military aid transferred to Ukraine. On the same day, Germany announced that it will increase military aid for Ukraine by another €3.8 billion this year. Following a few months of reduced supplies, Western nations are once again surging their support for Kiev.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has once again expressed Beijing's support for Kazakh independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is another step in Astana's pivot away from Russia and towards alternative allies.
Wang Yi's statement came after his meeting with Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev on Monday. The Chinese foreign minister traveled to Astana to attend a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization taking place in the city. Kazakhstan is home to a large Russian minority, which makes up about 15% of the population. Russians form the majority in some northern areas bordering Russia. Calls for the annexation of Russian majority lands are common in Putin-friendly Russian media, especially since the invasion of Ukraine. Chinese statements on Kazakh territorial integrity may be read as a message to Moscow that an attempt to take over Kazakh territory in a manner similar to that used in Ukraine would not be tolerated by Beijing. Kazakhstan has been marginalizing its ties with Russia in recent years and in turn developing closer ties with China and to a lesser extent with the EU and the US.
Ukraine is officially barred from using US-supplied weapons on the internationally recognized territory of Russia. Now a group of US congressmen is trying to change that.
The bipartisan group wrote a letter to U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin urging him to change U.S. policy in that regard. The Pentagon has long held firm to its stance, even calling for Ukraine to stop its campaign of drone strikes inside Russia conducted with Ukrainian-built drones. Earlier this month, UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron announced a change of a similar British policy, explicitly allowing for the use of UK-supplied weapons on Russian territory. Ukraine was able to strike Russian rear areas in most sectors of the front line, but the new Russian offensive in Kharkiv region poses a challenge, as the rear areas are within Russia. Washington's approval for the use of its weapons on Russian territory would allow Kyiv to strike Russian logistics, lessening the pressure on Ukrainian troops.
Moldova has signed a security and defense partnership with the European Union. This is the first time the EU has signed such an agreement.
The agreement was signed on Tuesday in Brussels by Moldovan Prime Minister Dorin Recean and the EU's foreign policy chief Josep Borrell. The EU diplomat stated that the partnership is intended to pave the way for a joint approach to security challenges, more effective engagement between the two sides, and new areas of cooperation. The current administration of Moldova is strongly pro-EU and intends to join the bloc. The referendum on joining has been set up for October 20th. The Chisinau's possible membership would be complicated by the occupation of a part of Moldovan territory by the breakaway state of Transnistria. Its government is strongly pro-Russian, and a small contingent of Russian soldiers is also present in the territory.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.